I need to start this one with an admission because I think it's the most honest way into this topic. For a long time, I got this wrong. If you'd asked me years ago what mattered most for long-term health, I would have told you without hesitation that cardiovascular fitness was the foundation everything else sits on top of. Get your heart rate up, protect your cardiovascular system, log your cardio minutes, and the rest would follow. I built a lot of my own training around that belief. And when I finally sat down and went through the actual mortality data, the longitudinal cohort studies, the mechanistic research on skeletal muscle, I realized I had the hierarchy wrong. Not that cardio doesn't matter. It absolutely does. And I'll spend real time on that data too. But muscle, specifically muscular strength, and the physiological reserve it represents, turned out to be the more consistently powerful predictor of whether people actually stay alive and stay functionally independent as they age. I want to walk you through exactly how I got this wrong, what changed my mind, and what I think you should actually be doing differently based on where the evidence currently stands. Let me start with where my thinking used to be, because I suspect a lot of people watching this are exactly where I was. I came up in a fitness culture that treated cardio as the serious, health-focused form of exercise and treated strength training as something closer to a vanity pursuit, useful if you wanted to look a certain way, but secondary if your actual goal was living a long, healthy life. Runners were the ones doing it for their heart. Lifters were the ones doing it for aesthetics. That framing is deeply embedded in a lot of mainstream health messaging, and I absorbed it uncritically for years before I actually went looking at what the data said. I remember treating leg day as something I'd skip when short on time while protecting my morning run almost religiously, because somewhere along the way, I'd absorbed the idea that the run was the thing, actually doing something for my long-term health, and the resistance training was optional polish on top of that foundation. I want to be honest that this wasn't a casual assumption I held loosely. It shaped years of actual training decisions, and unwinding it required more than a single study. It required going back through a large body of evidence and letting it genuinely update how I thought about the entire relationship between exercise and lifespan. The moment that cracked this open for me was coming across a study published in The Lancet, part of the large international peer cohort, which followed adults across a wide range of countries and measured grip strength, a simple, well-validated proxy for overall muscular strength, alongside standard cardiovascular risk factors. What they found was that grip strength was more strongly associated with all-cause mortality and with cardiovascular mortality specifically than systolic blood pressure, was citation, The Lancet, 2015, the Pure study on grip strength and mortality. I remember reading that finding and having to read it again because it directly contradicted the mental hierarchy I'd been operating under for years. A simple measure of muscular strength was outperforming one of the most heavily monitored, heavily treated risk factors in all of cardiovascular medicine as a predictor of who was going to die. I want to be clear that this wasn't a one-off cherry-picked finding, because that's exactly the kind of thing I would have dismissed a few years earlier if I'd encountered it in isolation. Multiple subsequent meta-analyses have replicated this general pattern, finding that measures of muscular strength are consistently and independently associated with lower all-cause mortality, even after statistically controlling for cardiovascular fitness, body weight, and other established risk factors, citation. This pattern has been confirmed across multiple meta-analyses published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, examining muscular strength and mortality risk. Strength wasn't simply acting as a stand-in for general fitness or a healthy lifestyle. It appeared to be contributing something of its own, independent of how well someone's cardiovascular system was functioning. I also want to mention that this pattern holds up across sex and across different populations, which was another thing that impressed me when I actually dug into the literature rather than relying on a single headline finding. Studies examining this relationship separately in men and women have generally found the association between strength and mortality risk in both sexes, though the specific magnitude and some of the underlying mechanisms, particularly around hormonal differences in muscle maintenance, appear to vary somewhat. Citation, this sex-stratified analysis has been reported in several of the larger cohort studies on grip strength and mortality, including subgroup analyses within the Pure study data and subsequent replications. This mattered to me because it meant the finding wasn't an artifact of some particular demographic slice. It was showing up broadly across different countries, different income levels, different baseline health statuses, which is exactly the kind of consistency that should make you sit up and actually reconsider a belief you've been holding on to. So the question I had to sit with was why? Why would strength specifically carry this kind of independent predictive weight? And working through the answer to that question is really what changed my entire approach to training. So I want to walk you through it carefully. The first piece of this is sarcopenia, the age-related loss of skeletal muscle mass and strength. And once I understood the actual trajectory of this process, a lot of things clicked into place for me. Beginning somewhere around age 30, adults who aren't engaging in resistance training typically lose somewhere between 3 and 8% of their muscle mass per decade, with this rate of loss accelerating considerably after age 60. Citation, Journal of the American Medical Directors Association, Sarcopenia Prevalence and Progression Research. I had always thought of this loss as a relatively minor cosmetic consequence of aging, something that affected how someone looked, not something that materially affected whether they lived or died. That assumption turned out to be badly wrong. Skeletal muscle isn't just the tissue that lets you lift things. It functions as the body's largest reservoir of amino acids. It plays a central role in glucose disposal and metabolic regulation, and it's deeply intertwined with balance, fall prevention, and, critically, your capacity to recover from illness or injury without a permanent catastrophic decline in function. This last point is where I think the mortality data starts to make sense mechanistically rather than just as an abstract statistical association. When an older adult with low muscle mass experiences an acute illness, a hospitalization, a bout of pneumonia, a hip fracture, they have a dramatically smaller physiological reserve to draw on during that period of forced inactivity and metabolic stress. Muscle tissue gets broken down rapidly during acute illness and bed rest, and someone who enters that illness already close to a critically low threshold of muscle mass can lose a devastating proportion of their remaining functional strength in a matter of days, sometimes never fully recovering it. Citation, Critical Care Medicine and Journals of Gerontology, Muscle Loss During Acute Illness and Hospitalization Research. Some research on this specific phenomenon has found that even a period as short as 10 days of complete bed rest can produce meaningful, measurable declines in leg muscle strength and mass in older adults, declines that would ordinarily take years to accumulate through age-related decline alone. Citation, this accelerated muscle loss during short-term bed rest and immobilization has been documented in metabolic ward studies published in journals including the American Journal of Physiology. That number genuinely startled me when I first encountered it. 10 days. It reframed hospitalization, in my mind, from simply a period of recovery from whatever the primary illness was into an active additional threat to long-term function in its own right, one that a stronger baseline of muscle reserve could substantially buffer against. This is a substantial part of why hip fractures in elderly adults carry such elevated one-year mortality rates, often cited in the range of 20 to 30% depending on the population studied. Citation, this elevated mortality following hip fracture in older adults is well documented across orthopedic and geriatric medicine literature. It's frequently not the fracture itself that proves fatal, it's the downstream cascade, loss of mobility, muscle wasting during recovery, increased vulnerability to subsequent falls and infections, that a stronger baseline of muscle mass and strength could have substantially buffered against. I want to spend some real time on the metabolic piece of this too, because this is honestly the part of the research that most directly overturned my old mental model of muscle as purely a movement tissue. Skeletal muscle is the primary site of glucose disposal in the body, meaning it's the tissue most responsible for clearing glucose from your bloodstream after a meal, largely through a transporter called GLUT4 that gets upregulated by resistance training and muscle contraction. Citation, Journal of Applied Physiology, Skeletal Muscle Glucose Uptake Research. Individuals with lower muscle mass have been shown to have a reduced capacity for this glucose disposal, contributing to insulin resistance, with observational research finding associations between low muscle mass and higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes, independent of overall body fat percentage. Citation, Diabetes Care, Muscle Mass and Insulin Sensitivity Research. Muscle, in other words, functions as a genuine metabolic organ, actively regulating blood sugar and insulin sensitivity, and by extension, contributing to your risk for an entire cluster of metabolic diseases that themselves shorten lifespan. I had never thought about muscle this way before. I had thought about it purely in terms of force production, and realizing how central it is to whole body metabolic health was, for me, one of the more genuinely surprising pieces of this entire process of updating my thinking. There's also a specific condition worth naming here that I think illustrates just how tightly muscle and metabolic health are linked, called sarcopenic obesity, referring to individuals who carry a relatively high body fat percentage alongside low muscle mass. Research on this population has found that sarcopenic obesity is associated with meaningfully worse metabolic and mortality outcomes than either low muscle mass or high body fat, considered separately, suggesting some kind of compounding effect between the two conditions. Citation, Obesity Reviews, Sarcopenic Obesity and Health Outcomes Research. This is a population that's easy to miss using body weight or even standard body mass index calculations alone, since someone can have what looks like a normal or even underweight body mass index while still carrying dangerously low muscle mass relative to their fat mass, which is part of why I think focusing on strength and muscle preservation specifically, rather than weight management alone, matters so much as a health target in its own right. Muscle also plays a meaningful role in immune function that I hadn't previously appreciated. During periods of acute stress or illness, amino acids released from skeletal muscle serve as a critical resource for immune cell proliferation and for synthesizing proteins needed for wound healing and infection response. Citation. This relationship between skeletal muscle reserves and immune resilience is discussed in research on sarcopenia and clinical outcomes in critically ill and hospitalized populations. Someone with greater muscle reserves has, in effect, a larger nutritional and immunological buffer to draw on during illness, which likely partly explains why higher muscle mass is associated with better outcomes following major surgery and cancer treatment. Citation. This relationship has been studied extensively in oncology research, examining sarcopenia as a predictor of chemotherapy tolerance and surgical outcomes, published in the Journal of Cachexia, Sarcopenia, and Muscle. There's also a broader concept in immunology called immunosenescence, the gradual decline in immune system function that occurs with age. And some research has explored links between physical activity levels, including resistance training, and markers of immune aging, with more physically active older adults generally showing somewhat more favorable immune profiles compared to sedentary peers, though this is an area where the mechanistic picture is still being actively worked out. Citation needed for the most precise causal pathways linking resistance training specifically, as opposed to physical activity broadly, to immunosenescence markers, since much of the existing research examines general physical activity rather than isolating strength training's specific contribution. Now, I want to be careful here because I don't want this video to swing too far in the opposite direction from where my thinking used to be. I was wrong to underweight strength training the way I did for years, but I'd be making a similar mistake if I now dismissed cardiovascular fitness as unimportant, and the data simply doesn't support that either. Cardiorespiratory fitness, typically measured as VO2 max, the maximum rate at which your body can utilize oxygen during intense exercise, remains one of the strongest known predictors of all-cause mortality in the entire medical literature. A large study published in JAMA examined cardiorespiratory fitness across a huge cohort and found that low fitness was associated with a mortality risk comparable to, or in some analyses, exceeding traditional risk factors like smoking, diabetes, and existing cardiovascular disease. Citation, JAMA, 2018, Cardiorespiratory Fitness and Long-Term Mortality Research. Individuals in the lowest fitness category had dramatically elevated mortality risk compared to those in even the next lowest category, and this relationship appears particularly steep at the bottom end of the fitness distribution, meaning moving someone out of a very low fitness category produces an outsized reduction in risk. Citation, this dose-response curve for cardiorespiratory fitness and mortality has been described across multiple large cohort studies published in Mayo Clinic Proceedings. I also want to mention the mitochondrial piece of cardiovascular training specifically because I think it deserves genuine credit alongside everything I've said about muscle. Aerobic exercise training is one of the most powerful known stimuli for mitochondrial biogenesis, meaning the creation of new mitochondria within muscle cells and, by extension, improved cellular capacity to produce energy efficiently and to manage oxidative stress, citation. This relationship between aerobic training and mitochondrial density has been demonstrated across decades of exercise physiology research, including work published in the Journal of Physiology. Mitochondrial density and function tend to decline with age and with physical inactivity, and this decline has been implicated in a range of age-related conditions, from reduced exercise capacity itself to broader metabolic dysfunction, citation, cell metabolism, mitochondrial aging, and physical activity research. So cardiovascular training isn't simply protecting the heart in some narrow, isolated sense. It's also directly supporting the cellular energy production machinery that underlies broad-based metabolic health, which is worth remembering before concluding that strength training alone could substitute for what aerobic exercise specifically provides. So here's the honest, updated picture I've landed on, and I think it's more nuanced and more useful than either my old cardio-first framing or a simplistic strength-only counter-narrative. Both cardiorespiratory fitness and muscular strength are independently, powerfully associated with reduced mortality risk, operating through overlapping but distinct mechanisms: cardiorespiratory fitness primarily through cardiovascular and metabolic efficiency, oxygen delivery and mitochondrial density, and muscular strength through the metabolic reserve, illness, resilience, and fall prevention mechanisms we've just discussed. Research examining combined strength and cardiorespiratory fitness has generally found additive protective effects on mortality risk beyond either factor alone, citation. Several studies on combined fitness and mortality outcomes published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. The honest conclusion isn't that I was wrong about cardio mattering, it's that I was wrong about the relative degree of neglect I was allowing myself around strength, given how independently powerful the evidence for it actually is. Here's what I think is the real practical reason that strength matters more. Framing deserves serious weight, despite that nuance. And it's less about the underlying mechanisms and more about what actually happens to most adults if they don't deliberately intervene. Cardiorespiratory fitness, left completely unaddressed, tends to decline gradually with age, but a substantial number of people maintain at least some baseline cardiovascular stimulus through ordinary daily movement, walking, taking stairs, general activities of daily living, even without structured exercise. Muscular strength, by contrast, tends to decline more severely and more consistently in adults who don't specifically engage in resistance training, precisely because ordinary daily activities in a modern, largely sedentary environment rarely provide sufficient mechanical loading to maintain meaningful muscle mass and strength. Citation: this differential decline pattern between cardiovascular activity levels and resistance-specific loading in modern sedentary populations is discussed across exercise physiology and public health literature. This is really the core of what I got wrong. I was assuming that because cardio felt like the more serious, health-focused activity, it must be the more urgent gap to address in most people's lives, including my own. But for the average adult, particularly past midlife, the piece of fitness most severely neglected and therefore representing the largest untapped opportunity for improving long-term outcomes is strength, precisely because almost nothing in a modern engineered environment provides adequate resistance training stimulus by accident. I want to go a layer deeper into the muscle fiber biology here because this is a piece of the puzzle that genuinely changed how I think about programming. Not just whether to train strength, but how skeletal muscle contains different fiber types, broadly type 1, slow twitch, fatigue-resistant fibers, primarily used for endurance activities, and type 2, fast twitch, more powerful fibers primarily recruited for strength and power movements. Research has consistently found that age-related muscle loss disproportionately affects type 2 fast twitch fibers, with some studies finding considerably greater atrophy and even selective loss of these fibers compared to type 1 fibers as we age. Citation, Journal of Applied Physiology and Experimental Gerontology, age-related muscle fiber type changes research. This selective loss is directly relevant to functional capacity because these are precisely the fibers responsible for generating the rapid, forceful contractions needed to catch yourself during a stumble, to rise quickly from a fall, or to generate the burst of force needed to avoid a dangerous situation. Some research has found that measures of muscular power, meaning how quickly force can be generated, are even more strongly associated with fall risk and functional decline in older adults than measures of maximal strength alone. Citation, Journals of Gerontology, Muscle Power versus Strength, and Functional Outcomes in Aging Research. This changed how I think about training prescription, specifically, not just lifting heavy, slow, controlled weight, but incorporating movements performed with intentional speed on the lifting phase, because this specifically targets the fast twitch capacity that's disproportionately lost with age and disproportionately important for fall prevention. Citation, this power-focused training approach is supported by research published in Medicine and Science, in Sports and Exercise on power training interventions in aging populations. Falls themselves deserve a bit more direct attention here because I think the statistics are worth actually hearing rather than glossing over. Falls are the leading cause of both fatal and non-fatal injuries among older adults, and the risk of falling increases considerably with declining muscular strength and power, particularly in the lower body. Citation, this relationship between lower body strength, power, and fall risk in older adults is well established in geriatric medicine and injury prevention literature, including data published by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on fall-related injury and mortality in older populations. Structured resistance training programs, particularly those incorporating balance and power components alongside traditional strength work, have been shown in multiple randomized controlled trials to meaningfully reduce fall incidence in older adults. Citation, this fall reduction effect of resistance and balance training has been demonstrated across a substantial body of randomized trial evidence, summarized in systematic reviews published in the Cochrane Database of Systematic Reviews. This is a genuinely actionable, high-confidence finding, unlike some of the more mechanistically uncertain territory we've covered elsewhere in this conversation. And it's part of why I now think of resistance training, particularly as people move into their 60s and beyond, as functioning almost like a form of preventive medicine in its own right, not simply a fitness activity. Bone health is another piece of this that I hadn't fully connected to the mortality conversation before. Resistance training is one of the most well-established non-pharmacological interventions for maintaining and, in some populations, improving bone mineral density, primarily because mechanical loading through resistance exercise stimulates osteoblast activity, the cells responsible for building new bone tissue. Citation, Journal of Bone and Mineral Research, Resistance Training and Bone Density Research. This matters because osteoporotic fractures, particularly hip fractures, carry the elevated mortality risk we discussed earlier, and the combination of adequate bone density and adequate muscular strength around the hip and surrounding musculature substantially reduces both the likelihood of a fall in the first place and the severity of a fracture if a fall does occur. Citation, this combined protective effect is discussed extensively in fall prevention literature published in Osteoporosis International. This piece of the picture is particularly relevant for postmenopausal women, given the accelerated bone density loss that tends to occur following the hormonal changes of menopause. And several studies have found that resistance training, specifically, more so than aerobic exercise alone, is effective at attenuating this decline. Citation, this comparative effect has been examined in research on postmenopausal bone health published in journals including the Journal of Bone and Mineral Research and Menopause. I also want to bring in something that genuinely surprised me when I first came across it, the relationship between muscular strength and cognitive function. Several longitudinal studies have found associations between grip strength and cognitive outcomes, including reduced risk of cognitive decline and dementia over follow-up periods extending many years. Citation, this relationship has been examined in several large cohort studies published in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society. The proposed mechanisms are still being actively researched, but likely include resistance training's effects on cerebral blood flow, its role in reducing systemic inflammation, increasingly implicated in cognitive decline, and its effects on brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein involved in neuroplasticity that resistance training alongside aerobic exercise appears to help support citation, frontiers in aging, neuroscience, resistance training, and cognitive health mechanisms research. This doesn't mean strength training is a guaranteed prevention strategy against dementia. This evidence represents strong, consistent associations rather than definitively proven causal mechanisms at this stage. But it's another piece of the picture that made me realize how far the benefits of muscular strength extend beyond the purely musculoskeletal domain I used to associate it with. I also want to touch briefly on mood and mental health here, since it came up repeatedly in the literature as I was working through this. Resistance training has been associated in multiple randomized controlled trials with reductions in symptoms of depression and anxiety, with effect sizes in some meta-analyses comparable to those seen with more traditional interventions. Though I want to be careful not to overstate this, resistance training is not presented in the literature as a replacement for established mental health treatment, but rather as a complementary intervention with genuine, measurable benefit, citation, JAMA psychiatry, resistance training, and depression meta-analysis. This wasn't a primary driver of my own shift in thinking. Since mood benefits also show up robustly in the cardiovascular exercise literature, but it's worth mentioning as one more data point, suggesting that the benefits of strength training extend well beyond the purely physical. Now I want to turn to what I actually changed about my own training and what I'd recommend based on where the evidence currently stands, because understanding the mechanisms only matters if it changes what you actually do. On frequency and volume for resistance training, the research on minimum effective doses has found that even relatively modest amounts of strength training are associated with substantial mortality benefit. One large study found that adults engaging in muscle strengthening activity for as little as 1 to 2 sessions per week had significantly lower all-cause mortality compared to those doing no resistance training at all, with additional benefit, though with some evidence of diminishing returns, at higher weekly volumes. Citation, British Journal of Sports Medicine, resistance training frequency and mortality risk meta-analysis. This was genuinely encouraging to learn because it means the barrier to entry for capturing a meaningful portion of this benefit is considerably lower than I would have assumed. You don't need an elaborate, high-volume, periodized program to move the needle on this specific outcome, though for building and maintaining meaningful strength over the long term, a more structured approach produces considerably better results. In practice, this means training each major muscle group, the legs, the back, the chest, the shoulders, roughly twice per week, with a focus on compound, multi-joint movements, squats, deadlifts, or hip hinge variations, presses, rows that recruit large amounts of muscle mass efficiently and closely mimic the functional movement patterns, standing up from a chair, lifting something off the ground, pushing a door open, that translate most directly into preserved functional independence as you age. On intensity, meaning how heavy the load should be, the research suggests both heavier, lower repetition training and lighter, higher repetition training performed close to failure produce comparable hypertrophy and strength outcomes, but for older adults specifically, there's added value in including at least some heavier load training, generally in the range of 70 to 85% of a 1 repetition maximum, because this appears particularly effective for maintaining the maximal strength capacity most relevant to tasks like recovering from a stumble or rising from a low-seated position without assistance, citation. This age-specific benefit is discussed in sports medicine reviews on resistance training prescription for older adults. Now let's bring cardiovascular training back in properly, because I want to be clear again that this isn't an argument to abandon cardio. It's a correction of an imbalance I let persist in my own thinking and training for too long. Current physical activity guidelines from major health organizations recommend a combination of both, generally something in the range of 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity per week, alongside resistance training covering all major muscle groups at least twice weekly. Citation. This combined recommendation reflects current physical activity guidelines published by organizations including the American Heart Association and the World Health Organization. I want to specifically mention high-intensity interval training here because there's research suggesting it offers a particularly efficient way to improve VO2 max in less total training time than traditional steady-state cardio. Citation. This comparative efficiency has been demonstrated across multiple meta-analyses published in sports medicine. This doesn't make steady-state cardio unnecessary. It has its own well-established benefits and tends to be more sustainable and lower risk for beginners. But for people specifically trying to maximize cardiorespiratory fitness gains within limited available training time, incorporating some structured interval training alongside resistance training is a genuinely efficient strategy. Zone 2 training, a term used to describe sustained aerobic exercise performed at a moderate intensity where you can still hold a conversation, roughly corresponding to 60 to 70% of maximum heart rate, has received considerable attention recently for its role in supporting mitochondrial efficiency and fat oxidation capacity. And some research suggests it may be a particularly sustainable, lower injury risk way to accumulate meaningful weekly aerobic volume, especially for people newer to structured cardiovascular training. Citation needed for precise optimal weekly volume of Zone 2 training specifically, since this is an area where practical application has moved somewhat ahead of dedicated large-scale randomized trial data, isolating this particular training zone from broader moderate-intensity aerobic exercise. More generally, a question I had to work through honestly for myself was whether combining serious strength training with serious cardiovascular training actually works against each other, sometimes called the interference effect, where endurance training potentially blunts strength and hypertrophy adaptations. The research suggests this effect is real but generally modest for people training at moderate, sustainable volumes of both, and depends considerably on sequencing and available recovery capacity across the week. Citation, Sports Medicine, Concurrent Training Meta-Analysis Research. For someone whose primary goal is long-term health and longevity rather than maximizing competitive performance in either strength or endurance sport, this interference effect isn't large enough to justify avoiding either modality. The combined health benefits considerably outweigh the modest performance trade-offs that might occur at the margins. Nutrition became a piece I had to take more seriously once I understood the anabolic resistance phenomenon, where older muscle tissue requires a comparatively larger protein stimulus to trigger the same magnitude of muscle protein synthesis response that younger muscle would produce from a smaller stimulus. Citation, American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, Aging and Anabolic Resistance Research. Research generally suggests adults, particularly those over 50, benefit from protein intakes toward the higher end of general population recommendations, often cited in the range of 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight daily, distributed across multiple meals to maximize the muscle protein synthesis stimulating effect at each eating occasion. Citation, this recommendation is discussed in position papers published by the International Society of Sports Nutrition. I used to treat protein intake as a bodybuilding concern, not a longevity concern. And updating that assumption was part of the broader shift in how I now think about this entire topic. The concept that ultimately tied all of this together for me is functional reserve capacity, a framework increasingly central in geriatric medicine. The idea is that your body's various physiological systems, cardiovascular, muscular, metabolic, immune, each have a baseline capacity above what's needed for ordinary daily function, a buffer drawn upon during illness, injury, or unusual physical demand. This reserve naturally shrinks with age across essentially all systems, but the rate of that shrinkage, and critically, the point at which it drops below the threshold needed for independent function, is substantially influenced by how much reserve you actively build and maintain through both cardiovascular and resistance training across adulthood. Citation, this framework is central to modern geriatric medicine and frailty research, discussed in journals including the journals of gerontology and age and aging. Someone who has built and maintained substantial strength and cardiovascular reserve across decades has a much larger buffer to draw on during an unexpected illness or injury later in life, and is considerably less likely to cross the threshold into frailty and dependence following that same acute stressor compared to someone with a much smaller baseline reserve who enters that illness already close to their functional threshold. This is really the deepest reframing this research forced on me. I used to think about exercise almost entirely in terms of how I looked or performed in the present moment. What actually changed my mind was understanding that training, particularly resistance training, functions more like building a reserve account. You may not draw on heavily for years or decades, but that becomes decisive exactly when an unexpected health crisis arrives. An illness, an injury, a hospitalization, precisely the moments when your baseline reserve capacity determines whether you bounce back to your previous level of function or begin a downward spiral into progressive frailty and dependence. I also want to be honest about something else that shifted for me personally, which is how I think about the identity and culture around this. I spent years associating serious training with cardio and treating resistance training as somewhat secondary, almost optional. Letting go of that required actually confronting the data rather than continuing to operate on inherited assumptions. I'd never seriously examined. I think a lot of people, particularly people who came up in fitness culture during the same era I did, are carrying around the same unexamined hierarchy I was. And I genuinely think revisiting it, the way I was forced to when I actually sat down with this research, is one of the more valuable things you can do for your long-term health, regardless of your current age or training background. I also want to acknowledge, honestly, that this shift in my own practice didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't purely intellectual. Restructuring years of training habits took deliberate, sustained effort. And I want to be upfront that the hardest part wasn't understanding the research. It was actually rebalancing my weekly training time away from something that had become an identity level habit. I'd encourage you not to expect this shift to feel effortless if you're in a similar position, treating it as a gradual rebalancing over a period of months rather than an abrupt overhaul is likely to be considerably more sustainable, and sustainability, more than any single week of perfect training, is ultimately what determines whether any of this research translates into real long-term benefit for you. So let me bring this entire conversation together into what I now believe and what I'd recommend based on where I've landed after being wrong about this for a long time. Cardiovascular fitness and muscular strength are both independently powerfully associated with reduced mortality risk and improved long-term health, and the evidence increasingly suggests the combination of both produces better outcomes than either alone. But for most adults, particularly past midlife, muscular strength represents the more neglected and therefore the more valuable target for deliberate intervention, precisely because modern sedentary life provides almost no natural stimulus for maintaining it, while some baseline cardiovascular activity tends to persist through ordinary daily movement, even without structured exercise. Even modest, consistent resistance training, as little as 1 to 2 sessions per week, is associated with substantial mortality risk reduction compared to none at all, though a more structured program, training each major muscle group twice weekly, incorporating compound movements and at least some heavier load, power-focused training, produces considerably better long-term strength and functional outcomes. Maintain adequate protein intake, distributed across multiple meals, to support the muscle-building stimulus your training is providing. And continue prioritizing cardiovascular training as well, whether through moderate steady-state activity, structured interval training, or ideally some combination of both, aiming for the established guideline range of 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity activity weekly. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, beyond the specific research, it's this. I was genuinely wrong about the relative priority I gave to cardio over strength for most of my own training life. And I don't think I'm unusual in that if you find yourself in the same position, having treated resistance training as secondary, optional, or purely aesthetic, I'd encourage you to take the same evidence I just walked through seriously enough to actually change what you're doing, starting with your very next week of training. Not because cardio doesn't matter, it clearly does, but because strength and the physiological reserve it represents may well be the single most consequential and most commonly neglected variable determining not just how long you live, but how capable, independent, and functional you remain for as many of those years as possible. This video discusses general exercise and health research for informational purposes only and does not constitute personalized medical advice. If you have existing health conditions, injuries, or concerns about starting or changing an exercise program, consult a qualified physician before beginning any new resistance or cardiovascular training regimen, and consider working with a qualified exercise professional to ensure safe and appropriate technique, particularly if you are new to resistance training or returning to exercise after a significant period of inactivity.